well, we learned about Enoch. And she said, well, what can you tell me about Enoch? And the little girl said, well, you know, Enoch, every day, God would come up to him and they would walk. And they'd just take a little walk every day. And she said he'd wake up in the morning and he and God would just walk together, just talking about different things. And she said, and one day, she said, they were walking and they kept walking and walking and walking. And Enoch said, you know, God, it's getting late and I need to get back home. And God said, you know, he said, you're closer to my house than you are to yours. Why don't you come on with me? And Enoch went to heaven. Isn't that a cool story, the way that the teacher taught that? You know, sometimes we complicate things so much in trying to, you know, teach God's word and trying to learn about God's word that the very simple things are what we can take home. Today, I know that we have talked a little bit, and I went back and forth on the lesson for today. I want to talk to you about what does God have in store for you? You ever think about that? I look in the mirror in the mornings and I say, who in the world is that? Okay? I look in the mirror and I say, you know, my dad was this age at, you know. It's just interesting. I look back 5 years, 10 years ago, and would I have dreamt that I'd be in this situation today, in this area today? No. But you know, we have to go according to what God has planned for us. We have to go blindly a lot of times into what God has planned for us. If you'd go to the book of Hebrews, we're going to start there. We're not going to stay there. But Hebrews chapter 11, the great faith chapter. And in Hebrews chapter 11, we learn about Abraham. And, you know, when we learn about Abraham, you know, we think of Father Abraham, you know, had many sons and so forth. But I want you to go to Abraham, or the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, and starting with verse number 8. Because this is the Hall of Fame. You have to do something special to be in the Hall of Fame. I look at, you know, I'm a sports fan. I wouldn't call myself a fanatic anymore, but I was. But, you know, I look at different halls of fame. I got to go to Cincinnati with a group and see the Cincinnati Hall of Fame, the Great America Ballpark. And up on this wall were 4,000 baseballs. Well, you might say, 4,000, what would they do that for? Because Pete Rose had 4,000 hits, and each one of those represented one of his hits. He was in the Cincinnati Hall of Fame. You know, we've had a chance to go to Cooperstown, my wife and I, to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And you walk in there and you see a bust of the different men at that time that are in their Hall of Fame. You know, some for great things, some for things that were okay. Some were sports announcers, most of them were players. But they had to do something really special, out of the ordinary, to be in that Hall of Fame. Well, Abraham, we find out, is probably talked about more in Hebrews chapter 11 than any other that are in the Hall of Fame. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should have received for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, and knowing whither he went. By faith, he sojourned in the land promised as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, their heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Through faith also, they talk about Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. If you'll go over to verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and as he had received the promises, offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Now, let's step back and look at our faith. Our trials, our tests. There's a theory, I guess is biologically true, about weightlifting. Okay, I remember as a junior in high school, I got into the weights pretty heavy and continued on. The theory behind weightlifting is this. When you lift weights, it actually tears part of the muscle. Okay, little capillaries, little itty bitty capillaries get torn. And then you rest a day and they rebuild. And then you lift again and they tear again, and rest again and they rebuild again. And they keep getting stronger and stronger each time you do that. Our faith is like that. You know, we get a test, right? And the test could be almost anything. Could be a little test, could be a huge test. But we get a test, and we go through this test, and we tear a little bit. But when we build back, what happens? Build back stronger. Then we get another test, a little tougher, and we build back stronger. And another test, and they keep getting more and more intense, right? But you know what? We keep getting stronger and stronger. And when we look back, we say, wow, that test way back here wasn't so bad after all. Well, that's what happened with Abraham. Our faith is like that. Our faith gets tested. You know, Abraham was constantly tested. He failed some. He was successful in some. But you know what? He was called a friend of God. Isn't that a great thing? We could be called a friend of God. You know, he moved to a land he didn't know. Maybe some of us did that. Moved to an area, had no idea. 4.5 years ago, that was us. Okay, that was us. We moved here. Somebody said, well, do you have family? No. Do you have, why'd you move here? I don't know. God moved us. Abraham had a promised son, Isaac, born in his old age. I can't even imagine at my age right now having a child. Okay? Can you imagine that? And Isaac was to be sacrificed. And we'll go through that in just a second. Let's look at Genesis chapter 11. Let's go way back to Genesis, because let's look at what Abraham had planned. Or actually what God had planned for Abraham. You know, Abraham was a descendant of Noah. And Abraham, as he comes onto the scene in chapter 11, you know, the whole land was in one language. He was a descendant of Shem, one of Noah's sons. You know, there's an issue going on with man. Remember the Tower of Babel? You know, God, you know, these people are going to build this tower. We're all one language. Let's build this tower. We're going to reach God up in heaven. We're just going to keep building. We're going to reach God up in heaven. Well, that God said that's not going to happen, so we confuse the languages. What happens next is, as these languages are confused and this debauchery is going on in the world, Abraham comes on the scene. And in Genesis 12, Genesis 11 goes through all of that. Genesis 12, now the Lord said unto Abraham, verse number 1, get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. It must have been pretty bad. You know, we look at things in the world today. I know I grew up, I grew up, didn't have to go to Vietnam. Okay, they ended the draft just as I was eligible. Okay, but things I remember, all the protests and all the stuff going on, the riots that went on in the 60s and things like that, and I thought, wow, this is pretty bad. Well, I look back now and it was bad, but I look today and it's worse, you know. But Abraham must have been in that kind of situation. You know, things were really bad. God said, get away from your family, get away from your friends, get out of this country, get out of Haran. Go, and I'm going to show you where I want you to go. So what did Abraham do? He did what God told him to do. He picked up and left. And it says in verse 2, and I will make thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abraham departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. Wow. Can't even imagine that. 75 years old and says, let's get up and go. Once again, the Tower of Babel was built, and man was again forgetting God. The land and relatives were evil. Abraham was told to get out of Dodge, right? And when God moves you, he opens doors. Okay? God opens the doors. You know, when God moves us to do something, it's not because we have the ability. I'm going to tell you that God gives us directions. And sometimes, you know, I say, God, I don't have the ability to do that. God, I can't do that. And all of a sudden he says, look, I know you can't, but I can. Through God, we can do everything. You know, Christ, or Paul, the Apostle Paul, when he said, you know, I learned how to be poor. I learned how to be taken care of. I knew how to do this. I knew how to do that. You know, he says, I've learned to be satisfied, okay? And he said at the end, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can understand every situation I'm in through Christ. You know, maybe some of us have lost, or some of you have lost a spouse, but you were able to move on. Some people have lost jobs, but you're able to move on. I remember losing a job, retiring from teaching and saying, I'm going to go with this friend of mine and we're going to go into business together, and all of a sudden it went ka-flop. There were some lies that were told, things like that. Didn't know where the next meal was going to come from. And all of a sudden things show up. God is so good. You know, we have to trust him. Trust him. Let him lead us to where we need to go. You know, trust is hard today, isn't it? You ever look at the statistics? I looked at statistics all the time. I was a business major. Statistics tell us right now only 18% of the people trust the news media. Wow. Only 8% of the Republicans trust the news media. Okay, I don't know how they figured the two out, but 18%. That means that 82% of the people don't trust. But God says, trust me. He says, you got to trust me. Abraham trusted God. When things, it's hard. Sometimes we want to keep people right here. I don't trust you. We're going to stay. Just keep your distance from me. I'll keep my distance from you. But God says, trust me. Obedience doesn't mean an easy road. Abraham went through several tests and challenges. Each one made him stronger. We're going to reach plateaus in our life. Just like, I told you about weightlifting. Sometimes I remember lifting and I got to a certain point and I'm lifting, and I'm telling my instructor, I said, I'm not making any progress. He said, yes, you are. It's just those little bits of growth are going to help you. Just those little teeny bits of growth. Okay? People that are on weight reduction programs, sometimes they'll say, I haven't lost any weight. But if they were to look at the very little increments that they're going through, They understand, yes, they are. That's the way God is. Sometimes we feel, well, I'm not growing, I'm not moving anywhere, I'm not doing this. But God's saying you are. Trust me, you're making those little steps. In Genesis 12:10, if you go there, this was one of the tests that Abraham went through. It says in 12:10, and there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. This was one of his failed tests. Okay? Sometimes we get a famine, right? Sometimes in our life, we're going to go through some dry spells. Okay, where it may be family. Okay, it may be families abandon us, or maybe our children are not where we want them to be. All those little things. Maybe a job. We're going to go through some famines. What are we going to do? Are we going to go to where it looks like it's going to be easier or better? Or are we going to stay where God wants us to be? We got to make those choices, right? Well, Abraham didn't make the right choice. He told Sarah, his wife, he said, look, we're going to go down to Egypt, and the people there are going to look at you and say, wow, what a beautiful lady. Just tell them you're my sister so they don't kill me and take you as their wife. That was a failure, okay? He trusted in his own strength rather than the strength of God. When things get tough, what am I going to do? Am I going to dig in, or am I going to run away? And I got to be honest with you, I've done both. Okay? I've done both. We need to trust God. In my coaching career, I coached for many years, okay? And I remember 1992. People remember 1998, and I'll tell you why later, but 1992, my team was 0 for 20. We had 0 wins. I had parents all over me, okay? What do you think you're doing? I mean, it was just chaos. I was ready to hang it up. I'm thinking, you know what? I've run my race. I'm done. We went into the district play. First game, we're facing a team that's ranked, 8th or 9th in the state, and we beat them. And I'm going, wow, we can do this. We got smoked the next game, I think 17-0, but and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to give it up, and talked to some people, prayed a lot, and I thought, okay, I'm going to come back next year. And each year kept getting a little bit better. And in 98, we won a state championship. But you know what? I was ready to give up right there. That was it. I was done. But sometimes we got to dig in and we got to say, okay, what do I need to change? What do I need to change in my life? And those are the things that help us. Now, every time Abraham stepped away from God, he returned to the promised land and he built an altar. You ever notice that? Okay. Why did he build an altar? It was a reminder. Okay. I'm going to build this altar. Every time I walk by there, I got to remember I walked away from God, and now I've got this altar. I got to remember to stay with God. And we need to remember that. Now, there was a great victory. If you go to Genesis 14, there was a big battle. Lot, Abraham's nephew, was taken away with all his people, so Abraham said, you're not touching my family. We're going to go after this guy, okay, these people. So Abraham and his servants, all of his people, went after these Amalekites, and they won the victory. Well, when they won the victory, the king of Sodom comes up to Abraham and he says, hey, look, you got this victory. You can have some of the spoil over here. I'm just going to take what I want. And Abraham said, no way. No way. You know why? Because people will say, well, the king of Sodom made Abraham very rich. God is going to take care of me. I don't need your stuff. He met Melchizedek, the priest of the Most High God. And if you go to Genesis 14, and let's look at verses 18 through 24, it says, And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and as he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. Wow. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies unto thy hand, and he gave them all the tithes of all. And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, take the goods to thyself. In other words, he'll take the slaves, you take all the goods. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread, even to a shoe latchet, that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldst say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, Mamre, and let them take their portion. So Abram understood who won the victory for him. It wasn't all these other people, it was God that gave him the victory. And so again, he did not want people to look at him and say, these people made you rich. We need to make sure that we honor God with everything. Abram was called a friend of God. He took things into his own hand as God wasn't quick, and sometimes he took things into his own hand as God wasn't quick enough. Anybody beside me ever do that? Okay. Take things into your own hand, right? We take things into our own hand and say, you know what, God, I'm tired of waiting. Let me take care of this. Boy, did that mess up my life for a while. Hopefully it didn't mess up yours too bad, but it really messed mine up. God has a plan, okay? God is working every second of every day in our lives. Patience, my wife always tells me on the road, patience, okay? You know, but this person's doing 45 and a 55. Patience. God's keeping us from something, right? You know, I've heard of people, you know, that were stuck in traffic forever and ever. By the way, I got stuck in traffic on the way back from Michigan this year, 2.5 hours. And I'm not talking stuck moving, I'm talking stuck. There was a truck fire a quarter mile away from us, and we could see it burning. Okay? And there was no way anybody was going to move. But you know, that taught me a lot of patience. We pulled up the screen over our windshield. I fell asleep. She read a book. Okay? Saw people, you know, a couple of cars would honk and things like that. No, you're not going to move. Okay? God teaches us patience. Okay? And be careful when you pray for patience, because you're going to go through a test. Okay? But we have to be patient. Abram wasn't patient. God promised him a son through Sarah. And what did he do? He had a son through Hagar. And we're still paying that price today, by the way. You know, whatever we do has consequences way in the future sometimes. Okay? Because through Ishmael came the Arab population. Okay? We have to be careful. We have to be patient with God. But he was still called a friend of God. The son of promise was Isaac, which was born after another lapse of faith. So in other words, he waited and waited. There's Ishmael. He waited and waited. Oh, by the way, Abram, your wife is pregnant now, 90 years old. You know, God tells us to be patient. All the failures of Abraham, once again, were because of his decision to do things his own way. Now, if you go to Genesis, we're going to jump ahead a little bit. Genesis 22. And if you just go a little bit before that, in 21 verse 33, it says, "And Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God." The everlasting God is El Olam. You know, God has several names, right? Okay, Jehovah, Elohim. This is the first time the everlasting God is ever used. "And Abraham sojourned in the Philistines' land many days." Now, in chapter 22, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will show thee." Whew. Okay. Abraham waited. Isaac was born. Now he's probably about 120. And God says, "Look, I want you to offer that boy up. I want you to give him to me." Abraham could have done one of two things. He could have said, "No, Lord, you don't understand. I waited 120 years, 100 years. I'm 120 now. I can't have any more kids, Lord. Not Isaac, not my only son." He could have said that. But it says here he obeyed. "And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled up his ass and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went into the place which God had told him." Can you imagine the journey? I imagine the journey was pretty slow. Okay. I know if it was me, I would be really, really dragging my feet. Maybe God will change his mind. Maybe God will say, "You know what? No, we're okay." But he didn't. This is the ultimate test. "Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go up yonder and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together." I want you to see a little similarity here. Isaac was carrying the wood. Jesus was carrying the cross. Okay, there's a little parallel there. Abraham's going to offer his son. God offered Jesus. We're looking at some very similar things here. "And Isaac spoke unto Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So went both of them up together. God would provide himself an offering. Wow. You talk about prophecy. So they went up. Okay? And they came to the place which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood on the altar and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Now think about that. Isaac's probably at 20, Abraham's 120. Isaac had to be pretty compliant. I don't think he fought and, I think, okay, let's see where this one's going. It's interesting to see how obedience is taking place here. And they came forth to the place again, and Abraham stretched forth his hand, took his knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, lay not thy hand upon thy lad, neither do anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. Abraham did not withhold his son. God did not withhold Jesus. God spared Abraham's son. He did not spare Jesus. You know, the test showed a few things here. Okay? The test number one, did God know what Abraham would do? We believe in an all-knowing God. Yeah, I believe he knew what Abraham would do. Abraham didn't know what he would do, though. God had to prove to Abraham that his faith was pretty good, was very good. Abraham learned a great lesson, that he could trust God with anything. And I want you to not only think about Abraham, I want you to think about Isaac. Isaac knew that his dad would not withhold anything from God. What a great lesson to teach our kids, that we would not withhold anything from God. And Isaac, I believe, learned that lesson very well. He would not withhold anything from God. Abraham had no more doubting. And I asked myself, what will it take for me, for my faith to be real? You ever think about that? What is it going to take for me, for my faith to be real? What's it going to take? You know, I've seen God work so many times. You know, sometimes I believe in divine intervention, divine appointments. If we look every day, we see divine appointments every day. They may not be huge. They may be just these little things, these divine appointments. But God is there. He's working every day in our life. I think I told you about coming back from Atlanta one time with some friends and driving. I had a nice red Camaro, okay? And my buddy was driving. I was sleeping in the front seat. A couple people were sleeping in the back seat. And all of a sudden I hear, kaboom! And my car flips up and comes down. Somebody dropped a piece of concrete off an overpass. Landed right in front of me. Right in front of the car, went underneath. My foot popped up because the floorboard got dented. Boy, you talk about the hand of God just saying, no more. It would have been that much more, and I'd be dead. Not that that would be bad, but, you know, be in heaven. But you know what? God protects. My wife went through the same thing, okay? Hers was right in front of the driver. Embedded a piece of concrete. Somebody threw it off an overpass, piece of concrete embedded right into the grill. We kept that for a long time. I don't know, we moved, it went somewhere, okay? But we kept that as a reminder. That was our kind of little altar, a reminder that God is still with us. Those are big things, but what about the little things? You know, what about those little things that God maybe just put somebody in our path? Maybe God just says, hey, you need a friend. Why don't you go over here? You know, Christ tells us, you know, what about our religion? You know, Jesus wasn't a religious person. He was he was pointing everybody to God, right? In fact, I think he despised religion, hated the Pharisee, didn't hate the Pharisee, tried to get them